Influence usually doesn't collapse with confrontation. It fades through systems that stop responding. In Latin America, this shift didn't begin with ideology or elections, but with control over movement, ports, corridors, and access routes, where decision-making gradually stopped flowing outward and began turning inward. What appears as a loss of influence is often a loss of structural leverage. This is not about popularity or rhetoric. It's about whether power still translates into outcomes. When multiple countries move in similar directions independently, the issue isn't messaging. It's the system underneath it. This analysis follows the pressure step by step, showing how choices narrowed, timing compressed, and alternatives quietly disappeared. The final reason is rarely discussed, but once it appears, the outcome becomes difficult to reverse. By the end of this video, you'll understand why historical memory of intervention at the Panama Canal, neutrality looks like openness. In practice, it marks the point where automatic leverage ends. For decades, access through this corridor carried assumptions about alignment. Ships moved, timelines held. Decisions followed predictable paths. That predictability has thinned. The situation forms quietly. Educational curricula, archives, and public memory across the region still catalog interventions, covert programs, and imposed outcomes. Those records do not argue. They sit. When new initiatives arrive, they are read through that lens first. Pressure accumulates without confrontation. Washington's decision problem emerges here. Engagement continues as if trust resets with time. It does not. Delay compounds the constraint. Each proposal is weighed against precedent, not promise. Cooperation becomes conditional, then cautious. Pause, the assumption fails. Once credibility is rationed, influence slows. Meetings take longer. Access narrows. Partners hedge language. What can no longer be done is rely on intent alone. What disappears is the ability to move first. The consequence is structural. Early options close before they are discussed. Influence shifts from direction to negotiation. Not presence, permission. From this point, sovereignty stops being abstract and starts becoming operational. Next, economic ties will attempt to substitute for lost trust, and that substitution will fail under public scrutiny. Options narrow faster than policy can adapt their strong nationalism and sovereignty sensitivity at border control offices and constitutional courts. Influence meets its second limit. Sovereignty here is not symbolic. It is procedural. Every external request passes through legal language shaped by long histories of extraction and control. The situation forms inside institutions designed to prevent repetition, not to enable alignment. Pressure builds unevenly. Trade talks, security cooperation, development programs all arrive carrying assumptions about shared interests, but nationalism reframes them. What is offered as partnership is filtered as leverage. The decision point narrows early. Leaders calculate domestic cost before international benefit. Delay becomes a defensive tool. This is where strategy stalls. External pressure, even mild, becomes politically radioactive. Governments step back not because they oppose cooperation, but because compliance risks internal legitimacy. Pause. The assumption fails again. What can no longer be done is apply uniform pressure across the region. What disappears is scalability. Influence fragments country by country, ministry by ministry. Timing compresses. Windows close faster than responses arrive. The consequence is structural insulation. Sovereignty stops being rhetoric and becomes constraint. Policy options shrink to low-visibility channels. Public alignment becomes too expensive, not cooperation. Consent, not alignment. Autonomy. From here, economic relationships are expected to bypass politics altogether. They will not. Public perception will begin judging material outcomes instead, and that introduces a different, more measurable pressure. Economic asymmetry without broad development gains along export corridors and industrial-free zones. Influence appears measurable. Containers move, numbers rise, on paper economic ties deepen. But inside these corridors, the limitation becomes visible. Value passes through without settling. Factories assemble. Profits travel outward. The situation forms around motion without transformation. Pressure builds socially, not immediately politically. Jobs exist, but ceilings remain low. Industrial capacity stays narrow. When growth does not convert into mobility, public patience thins. Leaders face a decision point. Defend the relationship or distance from it. Delay becomes common. Reframing replaces reform. Pause, the assumption breaks quietly. Trade was expected to substitute for trust. It cannot. What can no longer be done is treat market access as influence. What disappears is automatic legitimacy. Economic alignment without visible development becomes fragile under scrutiny. Timing compresses here. Elections approach faster than supply chains can adjust. Once public skepticism hardens, policy options narrow sharply. Incentives lose traction, threats backfire. The relationship becomes technically dense but politically hollow. The consequence is a ceiling on leverage. Economics continues, but persuasion stalls. Influence fragments between ministries and domestic audiences. Not access, benefit, not volume, distribution. From this point forward, ideology begins filling the gap left by uneven outcomes. Political identity, not trade balance, will start shaping alignment. And that introduces volatility. No spreadsheet can stabilize ideological diversity across the region election calendars. Not coups now set the tempo. In legislative chambers and electoral commissions, alignment resets quietly every few years. The limitation appears early. Governments inherit trade deals, security ties, and diplomatic language they did not design. The situation forms around continuity without commitment. Pressure builds through rotation. Market-oriented administrations open channels. State-led successors narrow them. Neither side holds power long enough to lock strategy in place. Decision points compress into electoral cycles. Long-term alignment becomes politically risky. Delay becomes survival. Pause, the assumption fails again. What can no longer be done is build influence on a single ideological lane. What disappears is durability. Every election introduces recalculation. Agreements turn provisional. Messaging must adapt faster than institutions can absorb it. Timing tightens. Policy windows shorten. External partners wait, then hedge. Influence becomes episodic, strong one year, irrelevant the next. The system stops accumulating trust, it sheds it. The consequence is fragmentation. Engagement strategies multiply but weaken. No center holds long enough to anchor outcomes, not alignment. Turnover, not ideology, cycle. From here, attention begins drifting. When strategic focus shifts elsewhere, gaps form without confrontation. Those gaps will not remain empty for long. Other actors will recognize the space faster than policy can respond. Decline of Cold War strategic centrality. Embassies shrink before influence does. When staffing thins and bases consolidate, absence becomes policy. The situation forms across closed desks and delayed cables, not dramatic exits. After the Cold War, attention moved outward. Priorities shifted. Presence followed. Pressure accumulates through neglect. Programs pause, visits thin, signals arrive late. Partners adapt by necessity, not ideology. Decision-makers notice the gap and plan around it. Delay compounds. Re-entry costs rise. Pause, the assumption collapses. What can no longer be done is assume momentum survives absence. What disappears is rhythm. Influence requires repetition. Without it, memory fades and alternatives settle in. Timing compresses as others fill schedules and calendars that once belonged elsewhere. The consequence is a vacuum that feels neutral but behaves decisively. Relationships persist, yet initiative migrates. Not power, priority. Not capability, presence. As engagement becomes episodic, leverage turns situational. Requests carry less weight, offers weight longer. The system learns to function without immediate response. From here, options narrow quickly. When attention returns, it arrives to occupied terrain, projects financed, standards set, routes promised. Competing partners no longer ask for space. They already have it. That occupation introduces a new constraint. Competition replaces assumption, and choice replaces dependence, pushing the next pressure from economic rivalry into strategic substitution across infrastructure and finance networks. Rise of alternative global partners. Infrastructure contracts reveal the shift before speeches do. Ports are expanded, rail links financed, power grids modernized, often through parallel offers that did not exist 2 decades earlier. The limitation appears in procurement rooms, where choice replaces dependence. The situation forms as options multiply quietly. Pressure builds through comparison. Financing arrives with different timelines, conditions, and expectations. Governments do not need to reject one partner to accept another. They sequence, they balance. Decision points stretch outward but leverage thins. Delay becomes strategic rather than defensive. Pause, the assumption gives way. What can no longer be done is rely on exclusivity. What disappears is default alignment. Once alternatives exist, influence must compete on terms, not history. Timing compresses as projects move faster than diplomatic recalibration. The consequence is structural dilution. Influence no longer funnels through a single channel. It disperses across contracts, standards, and maintenance cycles. Not dominance, choice, not alignment, optionality. As this environment stabilizes, long-term commitments become rarer. Governments hedge exposure. They fragment dependency across partners to preserve autonomy. Each additional option narrows the ability of any one actor to shape outcomes alone. From here, uncertainty begins migrating inward. When external relationships become unpredictable, policy credibility matters more. The next constraint will not emerge abroad, but at home, where inconsistency starts eroding trust faster than competition ever could. Domestic U.S. policy inconsistency. Policy calendars in Washington move faster than projects on the ground. Agreements signed under one administration enter review under the next. The constraint appears inside budget offices and legislative committees, not foreign ministries. The situation forms as continuity becomes conditional. Pressure builds through reversal. Priorities shift. Language changes. Programs are paused, rebranded, or quietly shelved. Partners adjust by hedging timelines and softening commitments. Decision points lose clarity. Delay becomes protection against reversal. Pause. The assumption fails again. What can no longer be done is plan long-term around U.S. guarantees. What disappears is confidence in duration. Even aligned governments begin treating commitments as provisional. Timing compresses because credibility now has an expiration date. The consequence is strategic hesitation. Large projects fragment into smaller phases. Political risk is priced in early. Influence loses its compounding effect, not intent. Continuity, not promises, follow through. As credibility thins, engagement shifts toward low-risk cooperation. Symbolic alignment replaces structural integration. Options narrow quietly as trust stops accumulating. From here, persuasion gives way to enforcement tools. When predictability fades, security mechanisms fill the gap. That shift will introduce a harder trade-off, one that prioritizes control over legitimacy and accelerates public distance rather than cooperation. Emphasis on security over social issues at joint task force facilities and border screening centers. Cooperation becomes visible, but narrow. Equipment transfers, training programs, and enforcement coordination advance steadily. The contradiction appears immediately. Security deepens while everyday conditions remain unchanged. The situation forms where protection outruns perception. Pressure builds among populations, not institutions. Violence metrics may shift, yet housing, wages, and services lag. When policy focuses on containment, legitimacy thins. Leaders face a decision problem. Continue prioritizing security cooperation or risk public backlash by appearing externally directed. Delay becomes avoidance. Pause. The assumption breaks. What can no longer be done is treat security outcomes as social consent. What disappears is narrative alignment. Enforcement cooperation starts symbolizing control rather than partnership. Timing compresses as public patience shortens faster than security gains can register. The consequence is alienation. Influence loses its social base. Cooperation persists at the top while distance grows below, not stability. Legitimacy, not enforcement, acceptance. As this gap widens, governments insulate security ties from public debate. Transparency drops, flexibility narrows, influence becomes quieter and weaker. From here, systems begin routing around external leadership altogether. Regional coordination increases precisely to avoid the political cost of visible alignment. That redirection introduces a new constraint. Influence is no longer rejected openly. It has bypassed structurally regional integration without U.S. leadership. Trade corridors linking neighboring states tell the story before summits do. Customs harmonization advances. Payment systems interlock. Transport standards align across borders. The consequence appears early. Coordination no longer requires external sponsorship. The situation forms as regional systems begin closing their own loops. Pressure builds through efficiency. Agreements move faster when fewer outside approvals are needed. Disputes resolve internally. Decision points shift inward where shared interests outweigh external preferences. Delay favors regional consensus, not external input. Pause, the assumption gives way. What can no longer be done is set agendas from outside the system. What disappears is gatekeeping power. Once integration reaches operational depth, influence must pass through regional mechanisms, or wait. Timing compresses as calendars synchronize locally. The consequence is structural bypass. Engagement remains possible, but only after alignment has already been shaped elsewhere. Not presence. Centrality, not access. Agenda. As these systems mature, dependence thins further. Infrastructure planning, regulatory standards, and dispute resolution reinforce each other. Influence becomes peripheral by design, not by rejection. From here, the final constraint emerges. When systems function without external direction, the decisive factor is domestic legitimacy. The next pressure is not diplomatic or economic. It is political agency, where outcomes are chosen internally, and external influence becomes conditional at best. Strong local political agency ballots, not treaties, impose the final boundary. In polling stations and protest routes, outcomes crystallize long before foreign preferences are registered. The situation forms inside domestic legitimacy, where authority is granted locally and withdrawn the same way. External power can observe, advise, and react. It cannot substitute. Pressure builds as expectations collide. Governments must answer to voters first, markets second, partners last. When alignment carries visible domestic cost, leaders recalibrate. Decision points compress around election dates. Delay becomes survival. Alignment becomes conditional. Pause, the last assumption dissolves. What can no longer be done is override internal choice. What disappears is recoverability. Once political agency consolidates, influence shifts from shaping outcomes to negotiating consequences. Timing tightens because legitimacy cycles move faster than diplomacy. The consequence is systemic closure. Power persists, but control does not. Strategy becomes reactive to domestic mandates. Options narrow to accommodation, patience, or distance. Not control. Consent, not leverage, legitimacy. This outcome extends beyond the region. It establishes a precedent for influence in a multipolar world where access exists without authority and presence without priority. Geography funnels choices. Technology accelerates them. When decision points close locally, external strategy adjusts or fails. The collapse is quiet. It leaves fewer levers, not fewer relationships. Power becomes conditional, and locally bounded subscribe the channel for more VDOS.